Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a NEOS webinar. This one is our webinar about overcoming the hurdles of product portfolio expansion. My name is Victoria. I am the marketing manager here at NEOS, and I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar today. We're just going to give it a few more seconds for folks to sign in, and in the meantime, we will go over the agenda for our webinar. Now, I'm not sure if anybody noticed, but it may say that this webinar is going to go from 12 to 1 o'clock today. And being that we are coming up on a holiday weekend, we thought we'd give you some of your lunch hour back. So we are truncating it to half an hour. So we'll get really intense into these questions and the answers, and our panelists will really concentrate their expertise. In today's webinar, we will cover the common barriers preventing product portfolio expansion and how to get past those barriers. And then we'll also give you some recommendations to give you a little bit more confidence in your own capability to put this into action. I do want to note that after today's webinar, you are entitled to a 45-minute complimentary consult with an expert, either at NEOS or Milliman. And I do want to stress that this is really no sales pitch. It's just another way for us to say thank you for attending today and have all of your questions answered. NEOS and Milliman have entered into a relationship together, so we do also have some joint offerings. If you have any questions about those and how you can benefit from them, feel free to peruse the NEOS website, or we'll give you some contact information at the end and you can ask us directly. Today, our panelists are going to be Steve Lay and Kelly Rabin. Steve Lay has worked for 25 years in the insurance industry, and he's worked primarily with life and annuity products, bridging the gap between IT and operations. And he is the managing consultant at NEOS. We also have Kelly Rabin, who is a consulting actuary at Milliman. She has spent 9 years working on product development at insurance companies before she joined Milliman in February 2014. I do also want to let you know that we sent out kind of a quick informal survey out to our networks before this webinar to get a little bit more detail about some of the challenges that professionals just like you are having. So this graph will show you kind of the spread of who took the survey. And you can see we have a good mix of product development folks, actuarial, IT operations, and some people in another category. If at all you are interested in the survey results, feel free to reach out to us as well, and we can get you the raw survey results. So why don't we dive right in here to our first question, which is which process steps create the most pain for your organization? And our survey results say that about 82% of folks picked system changes to support it as one of their top 2 pain points. So Steve, I'm going to kick it right over to you, and why don't you discuss that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so this isn't a terribly surprising finding. We certainly see that systems remain a pretty significant barrier to new products, and there's been a lot of activity across the industry to replace systems, to try and make the system environment simpler for new products. So companies are looking for applications, policy admin systems in particular, that will allow them to configure their products rather than having to put a lot of that into code. Issues around the plan codes are significant, especially with older systems. So it's not particularly surprising, although I would say that we see a pretty significant gap between those companies that are really head-on addressing this issue around system challenges and those that are not. So said another way, companies are looking at their legacy platforms, they're looking at the barriers to product deployment and they're trying to address that pretty head on. So they're looking for systems that have configurable engines to improve their product design, or I should say product implementation. Kelly, do you have some thoughts on this?
I do. So what we've really seen from a product and actuarial side is that IT is really interested in partnering with us on innovation, but sometimes they don't understand the product-specific requirements. Most IT people have, they're hired to do IT. That's what they're really good at, and they may or may not have a strong insurance background. An example where I saw this come into play was UL with secondary guarantees, just trying to build out a complex shadow account product there. There's a lot of permutations to think about there that may not be obvious. So for example, what happens if a customer pays a premium or early or pays it late? Really, the illustration or the system itself from a base case is just going to assume that whatever date that premium comes in, that's when interest gets credited from, that's where the shadow account grows from. But in fact, that's really not how you want it to work. You want a customer to have some grace on either side of that, so that they say, I pay my premium 8 days early, why is my shadow account suddenly huge? Or really the bigger issue of I pay it late, and then suddenly my policy is lapsing when I don't expect it to. And so I think really everyone being able to have good communication can help with how to resolve those issues. But I think it really is just the complexity of the products that is something that makes it harder for IT to deliver on an effective implementation.
Wonderful, thank you. I do want to note at this point that we will be taking any questions that our webinar attendees might have. Feel free to shoot those out in the little webinar tool. We'll do our best to take those as they come in, and we will also leave some time for questions at the end. So now we'll move on to our next question, which is when deploying new products, is your organization most likely to? And our survey results indicate that 64% of folks deliver late, but within acceptable limits. And Kelly, why don't you speak a little bit to this, because I know you had some thoughts.
Right. So when we first saw this result, we thought that that was kind of interesting, because we do hear from our clients that sometimes this really is a struggle. And so we thought that maybe more people would say that they deliver very late. But once I gave it some more thought, I realized that for many companies, having to push back product launch is the new normal. And I was just thinking about how many products have I built where you put this launch date out there that maybe was decreed by management as a date that you really want to hit, and you have to build this project plan that will cause you to deliver on that, but there's no flex in that project plan. And so if you run into any hiccups at all, be it with system build, filing, etc., it just is going to cause the launch to get pushed back. And so I think that that's sort of become the new normal for the industry. I will say the rest of the participants really did say that they delivered on time or faster. And so I think that is rewarding in that a lot of companies have figured out their product development process. Maybe they have eventually figured out that they need to be able to build flex into that plan. And certainly that's a best practice to be able to do that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The other thing, what I would add is just that this does suggest that companies are still encountering surprises. So they are, they're getting partway through the process, and then they discover, oh, that system feature or that feature of the product isn't supported in the system, or we forgot about this other system we have to update, or those forms take longer to load than we thought. So there is certainly an impact around, or this would suggest some surprises. But I think even more importantly, what we see consistently is companies that set the date before they even have a plan. So there's this idea of, well, if we just say we're going to roll this product out in November, then somehow magically it's going to happen. And when they roll it out in December or January, they kind of look back at that and say, well, it's late, but we really didn't put a good plan together. We kind of did the plan based on perfect, or didn't make a plan at all. So you know, the relationship between the product portfolio folks who are trying to lay out a schedule for the year and really get all of their product plans in place, and the relationship between IT. So does IT have information about the product, about what the plan actually would be? Typically, we see companies that don't have a good interaction there, where there's sort of a chicken egg problem. They don't know exactly what to build because they don't know what their systems can do, and then they set the date and then they try and hit that date. So we definitely see improvement that could be made there in terms of how companies actually make that plan from the beginning.
Really great points. So that actually transitions us very well to our next question, which really gets into some of the challenges that companies are facing when you get into your projects. So our next question for our survey takers was, are your product deployment challenges most related to? And 82% of our survey respondents said system complexity. Systems are inflexible, they're complex, and difficult to change. So Steve, as you had mentioned IT a little bit in your previous answer, why don't I go ahead and ask you to elaborate on this response?
Yeah, so this was not a particularly surprising result. You know, we see complexity really coming from a variety of different sources. One is the number of systems that need to be changed. So a company might have 20 or 30 different systems that need to be changed for a new product. Another is the way the product is actually built within that platform. So if plan codes are the primary way, then you have to replicate those plan codes. A lot of those older systems have dozens of places that need to be changed for each project or for each product. So that's a major issue. Actually, we're also seeing that the flexibility of the platforms can actually add to the complexity. So if, for example, you have let's say an electronic forms or an electronic application system that's very configurable, it might be easy to change, but that's probably not the best example. Let's say a workflow platform that's very flexible. So because it's very flexible, it allows a lot of different approaches, so that adds complexity. And so that's a major contributor. And then just a result from, or complexity comes out of this idea that we've made all of these changes previously. So we did this workaround. We couldn't exactly deploy the product like we wanted or the system like we wanted, so we did this workaround, or there's kind of a kludge here and a kludge there, and that definitely contributes to that complexity. So those are the things that we see consistently across companies, and we've got we'll talk about some suggestions or ways to overcome that complexity in a few minutes.
Yeah,
okay.
Definitely the same thing. What I want to speak to is a couple of these other points where we also saw a number of companies having issues. The first one is in terms of staff being, insufficient, poorly qualified, or misaligned. I think most companies feel like they have overall the talent required to build out this innovation. What they don't feel like they have are enough resources. And the question there is, are they truly under-resourced, or does it have to do with how people are allocated? And I think it's a little bit of both. The place where I've seen this the most painful is really that within an organization, you have a number of competing priorities for product development, and you're not getting sufficient direction from the top about priorities. And so let's say you have people building a life insurance product or people building an annuity product, and unless you're a very large company, you may have some overlapping filing resources, maybe some overlapping legal resources, operations, sort of all of those things. And what we've seen is that makes it hard for people to say, well, what do I work on? And then there's just sort of the reality of the timeline of, well, how do I possibly meet both of these timelines? And so having a really strong governance process where people actually have those hard conversations and accept reality, I think is relevant. Otherwise, you really need to throw more resources at it. Another place where I've seen it is if you have the same people, and this is particularly in IT, responsible for both product development and production. So maybe you're making, and maybe it's not quite production, but more you have day 2 items that you're handling on prior launched products. So if you're trying to handle those day 2 items and move forward on a new product, well, those are going to be competing priorities that you need to realize. The other item I wanted to address is the throughput. And the companies really struggle with, I have this, I have to have one thing done, then another thing done, and I have all of these dependencies. And one place I've seen that being a challenge is in terms of specifications, because all of the downstream areas really do have to have the specifications locked down. And so to the extent that those are still in flux or that those are changing, you run into a situation where IT feels like they can't start their work, the contract can't be drafted, and then that's going to hold up the whole process. What we recommend is that ultimately you get strawman specs drafted as soon as you can, typically by the product area, that it would at least high level address the items that are really specific about this product. So you probably don't have to have issue ages nailed down at that point in time, but let's say you have a really unique feature that you're bringing to the table. Well, let's get that on the table early on so that areas can start to research and prepare for that.
Great.
So I wanted to come back and just talk about some of the solutions or ways to deal with complexity, and there are really 4 ways to deal with the system complexity problem. Within the IT department, the first is to really factor that into your decision making. So if you're selecting a new platform, or you're deciding how to create an interface, or you're deciding how to implement a particular application, you really need to think about simplicity as being a primary goal. So what are some ways that we can simplify the infrastructure? The second is really affects maybe the product portfolio people, and that's to give IT sufficient time to actually deploy in a more simplistic way, rather than time boxing IT to force them into some decisions that are maybe not ideal, but they're quick. And so it's important to give them adequate runway to really think through how that product is going to get deployed. The third is to know your risks. So understand which applications, which systems are really going to be the long pole in the project plan, and build the product that's realistic to address that most troublesome or time sucking system. And then the fourth is to really create repeatability, and we see that being a big struggle when companies look at expanding into new product types or new product lines. They are branching into areas that maybe they haven't done before, so it's not repeatable. But to whatever degree possible, to really document that repeatable process, so you know for each project, or each product I should say, which systems are going to be the most problematic. So just some practical things to think about there in terms of dealing with the system complexity problem, how companies have been addressing and should be addressing it.
Great, thank you so much. I actually do see that we have a question, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kyle, who is monitoring responses, comments, and questions, so that she can bring that to our attention.
Sure. So we have one person on the call who would like to know a little bit more, if you guys have comments around traditional product development and Agile. Does it help solve the problem? And if you have a little more to expand on that. I'm not sure who would like to talk about that one first.
So I have not seen that approach. I think it could be useful in terms of getting information out on the table early in terms of where the challenges or problems could lie. So if you did kind of a Scrum approach to identify which systems are going to be most problematic, in terms of iterating on the product itself, that's probably not the best approach, but there is definitely an issue related to, does the system support it, or does the system, basically, should we craft our products or design our products for the system, or should we modify the system to meet the product goals that we have? And so that confusion or that problem might benefit from an agile type approach. But beyond that, I probably wouldn't apply agile principles to the entire process.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that what I've seen is that within IT, agile processes have been used within the product development process. And that's sort of interesting because it means that you really do have to have certain features locked down before that next sprint. But I've seen that works okay. My concern about trying to do sprints within the broader process is just that it'd be hard to coordinate all of those areas. One thing I have brought over to some of these processes, though, is the concept of maybe a daily stand-up, certainly within the given area, but even if the broader product team needs it, I think that can be useful to really facilitate communication.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the person who posed this question to our panelists. So why don't we talk a little bit about how organizations kind of work together. And our next question for our survey respondents was, when deploying new products, how well does your organization work together? 55% of our respondents said that there are minor conflicts that slightly impact the project. So Steve, if you could elaborate a little bit on that, that would be great.
This was actually a pretty encouraging finding. Over the years, we've seen a fair amount of conflict between IT and the rest of the organization, and not just IT, but certainly operations or different departments can certainly be at odds when it comes to deploying new products. So this is encouraging that there are some minor conflicts. There probably should be some minor conflicts, just given the fact that everybody has a different objective. So sales, for example, wants to sell more. Product design wants to make more money. And so there should be some minor conflicts. So this is a very positive result. Kelly, what are your thoughts?
So I think this is sort of, I want to say it's sort of a barbell distribution, though. You know, it's maybe depending on the project, sometimes it's really, you know, very few, and then sometimes it's major. And I think that actually comes back to the prioritization pain in the organization. The more pressure that people are under, the more conflicts you're going to run into, because everybody's trying to juggle what they're doing with limited visibility.
So do you see, Kelly, do you see in different product types having more conflict than others, or different scenarios where there's more conflict than others?
I think it really comes to complexity. One thing I'd say is if you're building a variable product, that is probably going to result in more conflict just because there's more steps, particularly with needing to file with the SEC. You're talking about bigger lead times. The other thing I'd say is the broader your distribution is, or potentially the more pressure that's on you to get sales, that's going to introduce conflict, because it basically, not to throw sales under the bus because this is their job, but really it's going to bubble up. If they're under a lot of pressure to deliver, they're going to put a lot of pressure on the product people, who then have to put pressure downstream. And so it really comes down to, you know, are you happy with your existing run rate and you're just trying to innovate going forward, or is it, I have to have this product, it's the difference between living and dying for my company?
Okay, great. And do you, either one of you, either Steve or Kelly, do you have maybe a point or two that folks can take away from this to ease this pain point?
Yeah, I think processes and data, and by that I really mean consistent ways of communicating, maybe more than data. So keeping everybody in the loop on where things are, and having a consistent process around how that information is communicated is really important. And there's a lot of kind of make it up as you go along that we see, particularly in smaller companies, where they're kind of moving out of this environment where everybody gets in a room and just talks about stuff, and there's not a lot of formal communication. I think larger companies are more mature in this regard, but creating consistent means to communicate where products are, how issues that are raised, challenges that are, barriers that are, emerge, that would be one approach, I think, to help resolve that.
Great, thank you so much.
One thing I would add is, hey, I just want to add one thing. So in terms of, how you can really mitigate this, I would say focus on the relationship. Ultimately, we all want to deliver, and the easiest way we can do that is if, fundamentally we work with people. And so if you're in an area, like if you're in actuarial and you have to work with IT, get to know them as people and really try to build that relationship so that it feels like you are pulling together. This is not always the easiest thing to do, and I think that it's something actually that product areas can facilitate. It's almost kind of a team building exercise where you really just get everyone to buy into what you're doing.
That's a really great point, Kelly. Thank you for adding that on. So we do have just a couple of minutes left, so why don't we touch on this last question that we had for our survey takers, which was, when deploying a new product, IT is perceived as. And actually, 55% of our respondents said that IT is really perceived as invested in getting the product to market, but we also had a really close second and third runners-up to that question, which is that IT is seen as not planning ahead and the primary reason that products take so long to deploy. So, Steve, why don't I kick that over to you? We have about a minute for you to answer, and then we'll get Kelly's take on it.
Great. Well, again, this is a pretty positive finding, that IT is perceived as pretty invested. IT has a very different role, and so they can often be seen as maybe not very warm and friendly toward new products. So this is good to see. So there certainly is. I think this is reflective of the fact that companies have found ways to engage their IT departments in a more human-friendly way, and so that's good to see.
And so, Steve, question I have for you is, we still do see the other items where IT is maybe proving a little bit of a barrier. What kinds of things can companies do to try to mitigate those issues?
Yeah, getting in front of the planning is really important. We talked about setting realistic dates. We talked about allowing IT to actually be strategic when they deploy a new product and not just tactical and time-boxed. That's really important. There certainly is an element here around IT marketing themselves. So market your services, market what you do, be in the environment where you're really selling to your business counterparts, and then build those realistic plans and then deliver according to those realistic plans.
Great. Kelly, do you have any thoughts or remarks on Steve's answers before we kind of wrap up here?
No, I think Steve really covered it.
Wonderful. So I do see that we have one more question, actually a couple more questions, but unfortunately we're really running close to our time here, but you guys are not going unnoticed. We will actually get your questions to our panelists, and we will email you with some details and some answers around the things that you're concerned about. I really want to thank everybody for participating and attending this webinar today. I especially want to thank our two panelists, Steve Lay and Kelly Rabin, for joining us. So thanks for calling in. Just a quick reminder that everyone who attended today is entitled to a free 45-minute consult with our panelists or an expert who would really get to the heart of the challenges that you're facing. Again, no strings, no sales pitch. So we really encourage you to take advantage of that. And with that, we will go ahead and wrap up everything. I hope everyone has a wonderful and safe holiday weekend.